Welcome, Internet, to Psychologist Casual Review, and today I'm going to be reviewing 30 Ways to Destroy Creativity of Psychoanalytic Candidates by Otto Kernberg. So I should preface this by saying that this article is satire. It's not a how-to-do list. It's presented as such, but the underlying phenomenon is how not to do it. Like, please stop those behaviors, kind of. And through this humoristic tone, there is, a mockery of psychoanalytic institutes and how candidates are trained. And that's something that I found very refreshing. I also think that he wrote it when he was the president of the International Psychoanalytic Association. However, it did not change much. It changed very little, in fact. And it's unfortunate because the problems he underlines in this article are still very relevant. When I was trained as a psychologist, as a psychodynamic psychologist, I encountered the same types of problems that he states in this article. And I'm not that old, so at least if things have changed, they've changed very, very recently, because I had the same treatment as what is written in this article. So what is this article about? This article is basically about how our institutions break our creativity, our will to give something new. And he basically goes through a list of 30, remarks or advice. It's presented as advice to break creativity. And basically I've had virtually, maybe not all, but like a big number of them. So it talked to me very personally. So that's why I wanted to talk about it, because it's very relevant. So for Kernberg, there's a massive problem in psychoanalytic institutes and even psychodynamic universities, that basically there is a right way of teaching psychoanalysis, and this right way, which only has the name right, is basically to teach all of Freud in chronological order and excluding everything that's more modern-ish. And that is so accurate that I cannot even describe how horrible it is. Because, of course, Freud is interesting. It's not to say that Freud is irrelevant or that there's not something to be gained in reading Freud. There absolutely is. But trust me, there is so much one can handle by just reading Freud for a duration of 2 to 3 years, right? If he's the only one you see, the only mind that you're encountering, and how he's often presented as the be-all and end-all of psychology, and you know it to be inaccurate because you've done your own research. And in this article basically says that you should try and postpone as much knowledge as you could from candidates, because basically if candidates start witnessing many fairies, they might become creative. And he says at the end of the article, and that permeates all of the article, that one should always shut down any form of spark, because who knows, there might be a fire in this creativity, and so it has to be completely extinguished before any threat happens. And that's the whole point, is that these institutions feel threatened. Therefore there's a creation of something like a dogma, in which basically only certain information is going to be shared, only certain relevant information, relevant not to the actual climate or not to the process of thinking of the candidate, but relevant to what the institutions want to pass down and how hierarchical knowledge is then transmitted. And basically he goes into so many details in this article, how one should always basically subdue any form of resistance, or try and interpret the resistance as basically something to do with true psychoanalysis and not as a real criticism of how psychoanalysis is taught. How one should always try and separate candidates from more experienced clinicians, because basically there's a risk that the candidates will see that clinicians also struggle, fail, and are not all knowing, and it would then fragilize the faith of the candidate in psychoanalysis itself. And I can't begin to tell you how true it is, how psychoanalysis, often how it's taught, is taught as an absolute, as something that can heal anything, everything. And he nails the point of how this is taught and transmitted, and at the same time people know that it's not the case. So there's a complete paradoxical level of communication here, where people know it's not necessarily true and are still sharing it as truth. And there's also how to deal with rebellious people, that you should basically try and push them out or ask them to resign, because basically they're too much of a maverick and you can't control them, so therefore they're a threat to the whole of the institution. There's also the fact of in this parody, right? He says that you should always avoid other schools of thought, right? You want your candidate to be completely entangled with your line of thinking. And that's something that's very true. Like, there are so many wars of school wars between, for example, let's say, object relations, Lacanians, Freudians, and so on and so forth. That, I mean, it's an ongoing battle, and basically the institutions present their way of thinking, regardless of the orientation, right? It's not about who thinks what that's problematic. It's about how institutions think something very narrow, and that narrowness is going to be given to the candidate, and therefore everything else is going to be kept aside. The only moments of reintegration are when someone comes in from another school to debate. And basically, Kernberg says in this article that you should always be polite, but always crushing. You should always crush other people's thought. And that's something that I've experienced when I was a student, when I was trying to make reason, for example, and share concepts of Jung or Adler, I would be kind of pushed aside also. So it's something that really marks comes close to my own experience of how the training goes, because those institutions are not there for science in of itself. They're also there as a power system, and psychoanalysis is no exception to this. And that's something that I find that this article, through acts of parody, are basically nails very well. That this is first and foremost a game of power, of who knows who, rather than who is good or creative. And that's a terrible sin, is that all of this is going to crush the creativity of a new generation that's going to then proceed on to repeating this way of thinking, that basically everything's going to start being crushed and crushed and crushed. And there's also this strange idea that you should wait until being severely experienced, 20 years working in the field, 40 years of reading the books. I'm parodying, right? But that's kind of the gist of it. You should wait to be at this level to really start talking about psychoanalysis, and start thinking that you can bring anything interesting to the field. And that's something that I have witnessed time and time again, that brilliant ideas are suffocated because there is a right order. And let's get this very straight. Brilliant ideas can come from people who have started insights that, of course, might resonate with something else or might already have been invented. And right, I'm not saying that every student is going to discover something new, but those things should be welcomed. It should be like a plant. It should be watered. It should be basically given space to grow, room to grow, in order for the candidate to become the best possible analyst that they can. And that creativity is essential when working with patients, because you're not going to recite the dogma that you were taught in school with patients. That has no value for patients to be taught the Oedipus complex or the schizoparanoid position, or paranoid schizoid in English. But it has no value. But your creativity, the images, the metaphors, the concepts you're going to bring with patients, that's the real crux of the matter of psychoanalysis. And that's something that's crushed. It's crushed because it's seen as an act of arrogance, as if the candidate was a narcissist for having ideas. And that's terrible. It's terrible. And I am very, very affected by this, because when you've lived something like that, it kind of echoes so much, the article echoes so much my own experience, that it's hard to basically stay neutral, because I think that it's an incredible flaw of our institutions. And I also think that people who basically hate psychoanalysis after studying it don't necessarily hate it for the ideas. They might criticize it for the ideas, that's fair game, but hatred comes from that, from what Kernberg points out as a constant systemic will to break any form of agency, creativity, or will to partake in psychoanalysis. And that's something that I think this article is fundamental. And I have really the feeling, and that's my personal state of how I think of things, but I think every candidate should read it, should understand that it's not their creativity that's the problem. It's a systemic ruling of power that, let's be honest, all the analysts don't always have good takes on modern phenomena. I'm not saying that they're wrong or that they're always bad, right? But God, there's some awful takes on things that they don't understand. Namely, things like video games, things like social media. I mean, they just seem, because it's not even a thought. When they transmitted their beliefs on it, and those were beliefs, they were not scientific constructs, they were beliefs. My God, it was terrible. I mean, I even had someone tell me, well, video games are murder simulators and are going to exacerbate the psychic violence of the players. I was like, what are you talking about? And of course you don't say that, because that's the other thing this article points out. As a candidate, you're afraid. So you're not going to talk, you're not going to criticize, because A, it's a position of authority, so you're not going to contradict it, because you're going to end up in trouble. B, even if you disagree, you are shown as being wrong or de facto wrong, and people make you feel wrong also, not necessarily by telling you, but just by a gaze or by ignoring you outright. And it's a testament to how good psychoanalysis is, that regardless of how bad the training is, that we're still so involved with the ideas. The ideas are just so exciting that you kind of you deal with that, but it's distasteful, it's not good. And I really agree with Kernberg that it breaks creativity. So if you're a candidate, if you're someone training in psychodynamics and the dogma is becoming appalling, just remember that it's not you. You're not to blame here. Your ideas, save them. Save them in a corner of the mind. Write them down. Do a YouTube video or go on TikTok or do something creative with them. Because you're not at fault here. The institution is. And the institution wants to keep the power and the status quo as it is. But never forget your ideas, because your ideas in 20, 30 years' time, when you're going to get at the point where you have nothing to prove to no one, right? You're going to be able to use those ideas, share them as an equal with an equal, and not be judged, or not as harshly as you would be if you were a candidate. So that's my advice, and that's what it goes beyond the article. Kernberg does not give that advice at all. I'm giving you my advice. Save your creativity. Never think you're fundamentally wrong for being creative. And never hesitate, when you feel comfortable, of course, to share those ideas. Because that's how psychoanalysis goes forward and doesn't stagnate in the squalor that it has always risked becoming of a dogmatic, insipid, and lifeless discipline. On the contrary, we need your creativity in order to go forward. And that's, I think, what Kernberg also very indirectly gives with this article, that it's needed and it must be preserved. So that's pretty much it for me. If you have any questions or anything you'd like to ask, please feel free to do it in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one.